Hey guys, welcome back to the Forest Podcast. I'm Matthew Christoph, and today I've got a really exciting podcast about climate change and its effect on the boreal forest. First of all, just the sponsors. Green Lake Forestry is a sponsor. They are Alberta's leading resource inventory consultants. They're the best. Also, other sponsor is Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is a outdoor apparel company. They have t-shirts and hats and toques, and they're coming up with sweaters and that. And they are a company that is a new company. They're trying to create a scholarship program for people going into environmental sciences in forestry or conservation or land reclamation that comes from sale of their clothing. So 10% of their sales go towards this scholarship. That's the game plan. So if you guys want some interesting clothes, you can go to damagedtimber.com, and you've put in the code yourforest10 at checkout. You can get 10% off any and all additional sales. Really good stuff. My favorite hats there. They have really nice clothing. It's the t-shirts are light and they're athletic fit. They're cheap. They're cheap in a monetary sense. That's about it. So I guess I'll tell you about the podcast. So today I've got David Price on. David Price is a research scientist with Northern Forestry Center. He he's the lead author on a paper that he sent to me. It's a really interesting paper called Anticipating the Consequences of Climate Change for Canada's Boreal Forest Ecosystems. He's the lead author for that. And we spent a bunch of time getting into climate change and its effects on the forest and the planet, and its effects on biodiversity and water and soil and permafrost melting and precipitation, jet stream, all kinds of stuff. We really, really got into it. There's a lot of information. You might want to grab a pen and paper for this one. He's a very knowledgeable guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. We got through a lot of information. There's lots more I could have asked him, but I didn't want to make a 7-hour podcast. So we tried to keep it kind of tight, I suppose. Not really, but we worked on it. Very interesting, very complicated. I hope you guys enjoy it. I really liked it. I've been wanting to get somebody on to speak towards climate change and the impacts of climate change for a long time, and I'm looking to get more people on in the future. So I hope you guys like it. And without further ado, there is David and I. So thanks for coming on.
Okay, you're welcome.
This is going to be good. I'm really excited about this, actually.
Okay.
So as we were talking earlier, I want to start off right off the bat, get some things out of the way. There's a lot of confusion surrounding the human impacts on climate change and how could we possibly have an impact on something so vast as the earth and the climate. And I think a lot of people have their doubts, and there's a lot of pseudoscience out there telling them otherwise, that they're correct and that there's no way we could do this and that this is just a natural cycle. I just want to get through that and kind of explain. Can you explain to me definitively why that's not true, why we are having an impact and why it's a problem?
I can try.
I imagine you can pull it off.
And I would say that often in these situations, I could end up having multiple hour-long conversations. What we know for sure is that the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere has increased. I mean, there are some people who even dispute this simple fact.
Really?
And what we know, basically from ice core records and other proxy information, is that before the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric CO2 concentration was around 260, 270 parts per million.
Okay.
And as the Industrial Revolution took hold, and as the emissions basically from burning coal and other fossil fuels gradually increased, the carbon dioxide concentration began to increase. Now, nobody really knew this until in the late 50s, David Keeling started making measurements of the CO2 concentration at Mauna Loa.
Okay.
In Hawaii, and basically he picked a mountaintop because it was exposed to the ocean, clear, contaminated. It was going to give him a good sample of what was going on.
Right. There's no industry really.
No
really
industry,
close.
but also really good mixing of the atmosphere.
Gotcha.
And you've got a huge area of ocean to the west.
Okay.
And over the space of 2 or 3 years, he was able to make these very careful measurements. And in fact, he actually set up, I think, sampling sites at other parts of the planet. But at some point, the program got shut down. he was able to maintain this operation in Hawaii, and was able to publish results which showed that the CO2 concentration in the space of 2 or 3 years had gone up 2 or 3 parts per million.
Okay.
And I would say until then, no one had really thought it was happening that fast, or that it was actually happening at all.
Right.
Although we do have people like Sven Arrhenius, the famous Swedish researcher, who even proposed that carbon dioxide concentration would increase as a consequence of fossil fuel burning about 100 years ago. I mean,
really?
The original thinking about climate change and the potential impacts of increasing CO2 were being thought about that long ago.
Right.
It's almost contemporary with Darwin's theory of evolution.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Keeling basically produced this information, and because of that,
When was this?
1958, I
Okay.
think, were the first measurements, and probably the first publication was the early 60s, first peer-reviewed publication.
So it's not new science.
Not the CO2 concentration increase, and I think a lot of what happened initially, it was sort of, oh my gosh, this is interesting,
Right.
but what is really the significance? And then as time passed and people started thinking about this, and the realization that it was not just happening in Hawaii, it's happening everywhere.
Right.
Because more people started investigating this, and they started looking at things like the ice core records. So they had the big drilling projects in Antarctica and on the Greenland ice sheet, where essentially drilling down, eventually presumably to bedrock, you can collect, as it turns out, about 800,000 years worth of data.
Isn't that amazing?
It's totally
That's
amazing.
ridiculous.
and the only thing that really stops it is the realization that about 800,000 to 1 million years ago, there was basically no ice in Antarctica. And
Right.
so the whole system was different. It was warmer then.
So arguably you could have went further if it existed. Yeah.
If the ice had been deeper. But the thing is that we are in an ice age now.
Right.
We have been through a sequence of interglacials, which come and go over a period of maybe 40, 50,000 year intervals. So right now we're in an interglacial, and the last big glaciation the height of that was about 20,000 years ago, and then we saw a major retreat of the ice sheet. But the data from the ice cores show that the CO2 concentration only typically varied between around 220 ppm when it was really cold, and maybe 300, 350 when it was warm.
Okay.
And now we are at the situation where the CO2 concentration has increased from that 270 mark, and it's now way past the highest levels it's ever been in that last million years.
Yeah.
We're now at over 400 parts per million.
Jeez.
That's about a 50% increase in the atmospheric CO2 concentration. And we know that carbon dioxide has this radiative warming effect. Basically, it absorbs some of the radiation in the waveband of heat that is emitted from the Earth. So basic principle of the greenhouse effect, and this is what keeps the planet habitable, is that we have an atmosphere with a certain amount of greenhouse gas in it, carbon dioxide and others, but carbon dioxide is the main one, plus the water vapor. And the water vapor is an interesting question because many people point to that.
Right.
Water vapor is far more important. But the point is the carbon dioxide which is driving the atmospheric temperature, and that is then what affects the water vapor content.
Okay.
So we know that the carbon dioxide concentration has risen by about 50% in the last 150 odd years. And the notion that perturbation somehow is irrelevant when we know it has a radiative effect, it basically adds to the global forcing.
Yeah.
What that means is that a certain amount of radiation is coming from the sun continuously. And incidentally, it varies plus or minus a little bit, like plus or minus 1%.
Okay.
And some people say, oh, that's all driving climate variability. Well, it is to a certain extent, but the effect is almost insignificant over the long period compared to the carbon dioxide concentration increase, which is a continuous systematic increase.
Yeah.
And we can calculate the effect of that increase in the CO2 concentration, and it turns out it's adding a few watts per square meter to the annual radiation balance. So we can calculate the radiation balance on the basis of what comes in from the sun, how much is re-radiated from the Earth, and the atmosphere plays a very important role in reducing how much is emitted to space. And what it basically does is it raises the temperature to some kind of equilibrium, And at that point, the incoming radiation is exactly balanced by the outgoing radiation.
Okay.
So as the concentration of CO2 has increased, we've shifted that equilibrium temperature upwards.
Upwards, yeah.
And
there's no other explanation for why the CO2 has been increasing. It's not like there's been an abnormal amount of volcano eruptions or some other...
Volcanic eruptions contribute very little greenhouse gases. In fact, I was reading about this not so long ago. There is an era in the geologic past, and I forget now how long ago that is. I think it's hundreds of millions of years ago.
Sorry, I'll just get you to...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's easy to get relaxed.
Yes. There was a period about several hundred million years ago, and I forget now, when volcanic activity was hugely important in releasing carbon dioxide, because it so happened that many of the eruptions were burning up accumulated carbon that was in the ground.
Okay.
But today, most of the volcanic eruptions are basically in mineral rock areas, and so they produce lots of SO2 and a few other things and lots of particulates.
Right.
But they produce very little carbon dioxide because there's very little carbon there to burn.
Okay.
I mean, that might not always be the case, but the big impact of volcanoes is typically to produce the ejecta, which increases the reflectance of the planet and therefore reduces the temperature.
Right.
And we know
sunlight's not getting in. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, one of the potential black swan events that could reverse everything is the unexpected eruption of a supervolcano. But if that happened, I think the catastrophe that would be just as large as the catastrophes we can anticipate due to global warming effects.
Right.
So where did they get to? I think that's basically it.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just I think that's the confusion is people, they find it hard to believe that we as humans can pull enough carbon out of the ground and turn it into CO2 one way or another that we can actually have an effect on something as massive as the Earth. And obviously the science is irrefutable at this point. We know that we are having a definite effect on global climate change, on the warming.
We're causing climate change.
Yeah, on the increased CO2 in the atmosphere, which causes climate change.
Well, I mean, there's the thing. I was going to add one little point, which is the reason why we know is basically that the correlation between the production and consumption of fossil fuels and the CO2 concentration is the correlation is like R squared of 0.99.
Okay.
And, I mean, it's coincident both in terms of magnitude and timing. We also know, basically, from our measurements of the CO2 concentration, that approximately half of the carbon dioxide that is released ends up in some place other than the atmosphere.
Oh, okay.
So we know that there is a carbon sink.
Right.
And in fact, we know the ocean is a carbon sink, and we know that the terrestrial ecosystems are a carbon sink. And forests become really important in that latter case because most of the carbon that is being taken up by forests and being turned into wood.
Right.
And again, there's lots of interesting questions about how that relates to forestry and what we do with forests.
Yeah, which is what we're going to get into eventually.
Yeah, hopefully. So yeah, I mean, that's
that. I think that covers it. I just wanted to get the basics of it, so anybody coming in that might be uninitiated, doesn't really know, they don't feel left out or confused.
Well, no, of course,
starting off,
that's
right?
totally reasonable. Yeah,
perfect. Okay, awesome. So we can move on. We can move on to the paper. So this paper that you were the lead author on, it's very, very in-depth, very long paper on the general. Maybe you want to describe it, just the general gist of it. You're the one who wrote it.
Well, I wrote it with 15 co-authors, and I mean, it was very much a team effort. Sometimes I thought I was just basically the shepherd. I was herding everyone else to get them to put their pieces in.
Yeah, for sure.
It essentially is a review of the potential effects of climate change on the boreal forest in Canada.
Right.
It ties into boreal forest in Alaska and in Siberia, but we focus on Canada, and we try to use all the research that has been done that has some bearing on this whole question about what climate change will do to boreal forests in Canada, and taking account of the effects of carbon dioxide, the effects of temperature change, precipitation change, and other factors.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I guess the next kind of leading question is, how do you, just the simple basic stuff is, how do we measure the actual mean annual temperature? How do we know that, like historically, for example, besides you said the ice sheet, so the ice is capturing carbon as it's freezing over. You want to describe that process? And I know you described a couple other things in the paper as well. pollen and tree rings.
Yep.
The pollen one I've never heard. I'm curious what that is, but
You've got me now. I was thinking the pollen. We can use pollen records to infer something about how vegetation composition has changed.
oh, I see. Oh, okay.
Plants that are more common will produce more pollen. So when you look at the pollen record, you can say, oh, in this region here, pine was particularly common because there's lots of pine pollen in the record. Pollen is a very durable material. So when plants produce it, it can be stuck into soil layers or into lake
so you're finding it in the soil
or in lakes,
or in lakes. Okay.
The mud in the lakes, because there's this valving effect. So you can both determine a relative abundance of different major species.
Okay.
And you can also determine when they were around.
Okay. Perfect.
And of course, the ice cores are also interesting because things like the oxygen ratio and the ratios of particular isotopes of oxygen can tell you something about the temperature of the planet.
Right.
So, I mean, and this is in an area which I don't know much about.
Okay. Yeah,
but these isotope ratios give us really good information about how temperature and carbon dioxide concentration have varied.
Okay.
We know that they have varied in a sort of proportional relationship. Mm-hmm. High CO2 typically means higher temperatures.
Right.
And one of the big complaints or arguments is, well, how do you know which is causing which? And to be honest, it's difficult to say that carbon dioxide concentration is driving the temperature rise, or whether the temperature increase is driving the carbon dioxide increase.
Really? Okay.
And there are good reasons for this. But that's maybe also a concern, because if the carbon dioxide is driving the temperature increase, then we think basically there's a feedback process going on, because the temperature increase is also driving more carbon release.
And vice versa, and back and forth. And it's just a positive feedback.
It's a positive feedback.
Yeah.
And one of the specific examples would be simply that as temperatures get higher, two things happen. One is plant respiration rates go higher.
Okay.
And microbial respiration rates increase. Mm-hmm. So if you have longer growing seasons or milder winters, there will be more microbial activity, and the plants will be more productive in the summer, but they will also respire more.
Right.
So you get more carbon being released through the decomposition of organic matter. And also, in the case of forests, you tend to get drier conditions and potentially more fires.
So the decomposition rate is actually increased as well as the growth rate of the vegetation.
I'm not sure anyone has definitively said molecular microbial decomposition rates have increased as a consequence of temperature increase, but the correlations are there.
Okay.
And you can certainly do laboratory experiments which show that relationship. Right. And then if you can say, well, over this era, we've seen this temperature increase of 3 or 4 degrees or something, which is happening in the northern parts of Canada. Over the last 5 or 6 decades, we've seen quite significant
5-degree difference. Yeah, that's
easily in the north. Now, maybe I should say that if you get into the forested regions of north of, say, NWT, maybe it's only 3 or 4 degrees.
Right. It's variable depending on the ecosystem.
It's variable depending on the latitude also,
right?
Because the higher latitudes typically get greater warming.
Oh, okay.
I mean, this is partly related to the ice melting feedback and the fact that we have more and more of the ocean ice disappearing, which is basically reducing the albedo. So the positive feedback effect is a warmer northern ocean.
Right.
We may also be getting less snow cover and so on. And all these things will ultimately contribute to longer periods of warming, and the positive feedback effect meaning even further warming.
Right.
And all of that then is driving greater evaporation and greater microbial decomposition.
Yeah. It's a very intense situation. Like, I mean, it just seems like everything that you do is adding to the problem and creating a positive feedback loop in one way or another. And
there are many feedbacks, and some of them are negative, but most, I would say, are positive. Mm-hmm. And another point to take away here is that negative feedbacks don't normally, I don't think you could say ever, totally eradicate the primary driver.
Yeah.
It stands to reason that if the first effect is to raise the temperature, the counter effect will maybe reduce the temperature, but it can't reduce it as much as the initial increase.
It can't go back to normal, yeah.
It can't go back with a biological feedback of any sort.
Right.
At least that's how I see it.
Right. Interesting.
I'm probably getting off the topic here.
No, we're well. I think
you need to keep asking me the questions, keep me focused.
Keep you focused. Yeah, I think the other one was the tree rings, just talking about dendrochronology and how that helps.
Well, tree rings are used a lot to determine how tree growth varies, and it's possible to show that there are periods of rapid growth and periods of slow growth.
Right.
And we can correlate periods of rapid growth with, in some cases, warmer conditions, but also maybe when it was moister.
Right.
And periods of slow growth with drier conditions, or possibly the effects of insects, for example.
Oh, like a stressor of some sort. Yeah.
A stressor or defoliator or something which slowed them down.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many other reasons why tree rings can vary, but there's a lot of evidence now being collected from, and the Canadian Forest Service has been instrumental in building a national tree ring database.
Right. Yeah.
Which allows people to look at growth rates across the country over the last, well, at least the last 100 years and maybe longer.
Yeah.
Obviously, the data get more sketchy as you go back in time. And that is one of the big problems with all of this kind of work, is that the data are inconsistent and they are sketchy as you get further back in time, whether it's climate data or carbon dioxide concentrations or growth rates of trees.
Right.
But there's enough evidence to show that in periods of warming, we see decreases in growth and vice versa.
Right. Right. So,
but again, it depends where you are, because there are going to be some parts of the boreal forest which are inherently colder.
Yeah.
Where a bit of warming will stimulate growth.
Right.
And we have to take that into account.
But just to point out, I just wanted to point out that these are the methods by which you are measuring past temperature, the increase in carbon dioxide, and you are using those to predict what may happen in the future.
Yeah.
So I guess the next thing I wanted to ask was about just predicting, because like that's what this whole paper is about, is predicting what's going to happen in the future with climate change, how it's going to affect the boreal ecosystems.
Yep.
We'll just get it. Like, I mean, we're gonna get through everything here eventually, but it's trying to the predictive model. What do you base the increase in, like, how do you base off the increase in carbon dioxide with temperature, and how do you know that the increase is going to remain steady, or is it going to be exponential, or is it going to level off, or just kind of what are the assumptions made, I guess, just so we know going into talking about this paper?
Well, when we talk about models, we've got to separate out what I would say are climate models,
right?
Which I tend to use, but I do not actually write.
Okay.
And ecological models, which I sort of am involved in developing and using, more using these days than developing. But the ecological models are inherently much less well developed.
Okay.
And there are two reasons for this. They're much less well developed than climate models, and there are two reasons for this. One is that ecosystems, I say, are inherently more complicated and more diverse than the global atmosphere. And I mean, that sounds like a bit of a cop out, but we have to think about the global atmosphere is essentially a physical system. It's a fluid. It's driven by an energy source that we understand. And even though there are many things going on in the atmosphere which are inherently complex,
right,
it is a simple system.
Right.
By comparison to the diversity of ecosystems on the planet, every one of these composed of multiple organisms and many other things going on. And at the same time, there's a ton of money has been thrown into climate research over the last few decades. And we have groups all over the world now who are developing climate models. And, the average ecological modeler would dream of having a tenth of the resources to develop a good ecosystem model.
There's a disconnect there somewhere, yeah.
Well, it's the way things are, and I'm not criticizing the system for saying that the climate research is fundamentally important.
Right.
It's just that there are many, many people doing ecological modeling who are probably working on a really small annual budget, and they need to fund a programmer and a postdoc.
It's equally as important as the climate data.
It's potentially as important.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that we have a lot less precision in modeling how ecosystems respond to a change in forcing climate. And I think we have a pretty good knowledge now about how the climate will change in response to a change in radiative forcing.
Right.
So the radiative forcing is really the climate scenarios that we keep hearing about. So these days it's the RCP 8.5 or the 2.6. And basically those are the sort of the emission scenarios which are used to drive the climate model. What happens if greenhouse gases increase by, say from 400 ppm to 600 ppm by the end of the century, as compared to what happens if it goes to 800 parts per million?
Gotcha.
And It's probably not an exponential response. It's probably more or less a linear response.
Okay.
I guess I'm not certain about that.
Well, it's predictive, right? So I'm just trying to figure out what the assumptions
we
were
try
in
to
this
avoid
paper.
using the word prediction. These are scenarios of
Right.
what may happen,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say that the reality is going to be somewhere between the really optimistic and maybe it could be as bad as the worst case projection. Right. But, you know, we keep hoping that humanity will get its collective head together and really start reducing greenhouse gas emissions sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
I mean, there is another fascinating aspect of all of this, which is that if we all stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, if every car stopped, every source of greenhouse gases stopped tomorrow, the climate would still continue to change.
Right.
And it will change because it still has to adjust to the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere right now. The oceans basically are a huge heat sink. They would have to adjust. It's not quite as complicated as it sounds. What I've heard from the experts is it might take 20, 30 years for the climate to stabilize. The oceans would continue to suck up heat, and that would carry on for centuries.
Right.
But the overall atmospheric temperature probably would stabilize. But wherever it stabilizes, that means that all of the things that we're seeing now, like the extreme events, the storms, the hurricanes, the big fires, all of those things will continue to happen and quite possibly will be worse on average than we've seen them over the last few decades.
Right. So basically the atmosphere is warming at a rate that the rest of the world can't keep up. So that the atmosphere gets to a point, say it does stop warming, it levels out. The rest of the soil, the ocean, the trees, the vegetation lines, the deserts, everything has to catch up because it has a slower speed.
There's a lag.
Yeah, it's a lag there.
There's a lag. In fact, there are many lags.
So even if it stopped now, it'd still be the effects are
the effects of the climate of this. If we stop emitting greenhouse gases, my interpretation is that yes, the climate will continue to change. We will still see temperatures rising. We will still see extreme events becoming more extreme.
Yeah.
That would eventually stabilize.
Yeah.
Sea level rise would continue because the whole system has to adjust to that higher temperature in the oceans and the ice that has to melt.
Right.
All of these things will continue to happen. Maybe they begin to slow down. But the consequences, the impacts of those changes will continue for decades and decades.
Crazy. So yeah, we have to definitely sort our things out here now before things get completely out of hand.
And adaptation of pretty much everything we do is going to be fundamental to just about everything that any sort of developed country will have to address in the next century and longer.
Yeah.
And I think, we're sort of seeing the signs of this now, for example, in the Maritimes with the effects of this winter storms and the dynamics of ocean, of storms and of flooding and so on. All of those things will cost money to adapt to. We need to think about building seawall defenses, building more stable foundations, building away from floodplains, all those kinds of things that affect human infrastructure.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and it's I think even someone who doesn't believe in it can see that there is more catastrophic events happening now than there was 20 years ago.
You would hope.
Yeah,
but
it seems pretty obvious. But
you would think. But I mean, there's a lot of people who still insist or want to insist or just don't want to believe.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's just blind faith in the system, that they think everything will be the same. The Earth is stagnant and it changes slowly and we'll be okay, and they don't know. But
okay, and I'd like to point out that human beings, Homo sapiens, basically appeared on the planet about 250,000 years ago.
Right.
And the human population probably only broke around 1 billion people around the beginning of the 20th century.
Right.
Now we're at over 7.5 billion.
Isn't that wild to think about? Like that's terrifying that's the case.
Well, I think so. I mean, if we think that most of human history has occurred in the last, recorded history has occurred in the last 10,000 years. We have no real knowledge of what human beings were doing before that 10,000 years. At the beginning of that period, there were probably 100 million, maybe fewer individuals on the planet. If they hit a climate problem, they'd migrate away from it. They could walk towards a retreating ice sheet. They could walk away from a drought.
Yeah.
And And some of them probably died because of climatic effects, but why do we have any connection to them?
Yeah.
But the point was that there was this natural resilience in the human population and in other populations, which we have largely eliminated now by virtue of the fact that we control the entire planet. We've built nations, we've built borders, and so on. People cannot migrate away from the trouble.
Yeah.
This notion that we've adapted before and will adapt again is complete nonsense, because we have never adapted in the way that we're going to have to adapt to the changes that we anticipate happening in the next 50 years.
So how much faster do you think things are warming now than they would, say, naturally if something were to happen? Like what is the rate of change relative to natural rate of change? I mean, I know that's speculation, but I imagine you have some kind of idea of how much faster we're moving because of our actions.
And the short answer is I don't.
No?
I don't know. It would be tempting to say there would be no change, but I'm not sure that's true either.
Right.
Possibly because we know that we are into the interglacial, that the ice sheets were still retreating, the glaciers could still be retreating, and so that would have a feedback effect.
Right.
But those things would be happening presumably far more slowly.
Yeah.
I mean, we can look at the change in temperature that we have seen from the instrument record that goes back to, well, certainly 1850.
Okay.
And there's no question, if you look at the data and if you believe the data, and there's some people who still think that NASA and all these other big groups are falsifying the data just to justify their research projects.
There's only so much explaining we can do in one
Well,
sitting.
if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can construct the most elaborate theories, but
We're pretty good at making up stories.
Occam's razor would say, go with the simple explanation first.
Yeah.
And the simple explanation is things have changed.
Yeah.
And we can see a 1 degree warming, which pretty much occurred, I would say, probably since 1950.
Okay.
Most of the warming, I mean, there's a trend, but there's a big inflection after around 1950
Gotcha.
in the global temperature record.
Right.
Most of that, so that's like a 1 degree warming in the last 100 years. We can simulate that with models, and we can simulate that model with the knowledge of the greenhouse gas forcing changing, because we know the CO2 concentration has basically gone from the 270 around 1850 to whatever it is today, and however it will proceed in the future as a function of how much economic development and how much fossil fuel burning occurs. I have a lot of confidence in the climate models, in their overall projections, and these days those models take into account the ecological responses as well, not in much detail because it's very, very difficult to run a global model and simulate at really high spatial resolution. But the people who develop these models are the experts. They are not dummies. They know the limitations of those models as well as anybody.
Yeah, I think there's a general thought out there for a lot of people who maybe spend their time out in the bush, or they spend their time, maybe they're trappers or whatever they are. They spend a lot of time outside and they experience it, and they might look and say, oh, those scientists, like, they spend all their time with models and predicting things, and they've never really seen it. They don't know what's up. And I think there's a misconception that people doing the research are unaware of what's going on out there, and I think that's completely false. And these are some of the most educated people in the world that are doing some of the best research, and most not only best research, but it's being vetted by their peers and by the scientific community to make sure that they're not crackpots making some bullshit up to fund their project, right? Like,
that's the theory anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, people have a right to be cynical about this. And,
I think it's good that they are, but let's be reasonable.
But I've had this argument with people, and so I said, well, let's suppose you go to your doctor who pokes around and then says you need to go see this specialist who happens to be an oncologist, who then pokes around and does more tests and says, sorry, but you've got cancer. What's your response going to be? No, I don't have cancer because it's not possible. You trust the oncologist to give you an honest assessment. Why are they not trusting climate scientists to give them an honest assessment?
Yeah. Let's assume that these people have spent their lifetime figuring this information out, and that they probably know more than you do. I made an example with the Canadian Olympic team a couple of years back there in, 2014, when a lot of people were losing their mind about some of the guys that were on the hockey team, and there's why is Jeff Carter on the team? Why isn't Claude Giroux on the team, and all this other stuff. And meanwhile, they win the gold cup and get
Yes.
the gold medal, right? And you realize, oh wait, Brendan Shanahan knows way more about professional hockey than me, some jackass, does. So it's like, oh, weird. It's obviously like he has experience doing this, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
I think people need to respect that professionals know what they're doing. That they spent their lifetime dedicated to this study, and you can trust what they're saying. And science is very good at making sure that only the good theories get through, only the ones that people can agree on.
That is, as a dyed-in-the-wool scientist, I totally believe that. And yes, we have the scientific method. The scientific method has evolved and become a standard approach to how you address a question and how do you validate it. You can never prove something is true. You can only disprove something.
Yeah.
And sort of one of the other aspects of the scientific method is that you might be the most senior, experienced scientist, but the young upstart who's just out of college with his PhD discovers something which clearly is right, and he turns the world upside down. This is the way science can operate. That's what separates it from every religion, where religion is sort of built on the notion that age equates with knowledge, whereas in science, that's not always true.
It can be proven in one way or another, yeah.
It comes down to what are the facts, what's the evidence. I was going to mention another hockey analogy because I was thinking about the fact that we've had this really cold spell recently, and there's going to be a lot of people saying, what happened to global warming?
Yeah, that was actually part of my next question is people are looking to say, oh, so what? It's going to be warmer. We'll have beaches. I like palm trees. Like, what's the big deal, right? And it's like, it's more complicated than that.
It's a lot more complicated than that. But I was going to say that people who think that climate change isn't happening because we happen to be having a colder than normal winter, and they should think back what a normal winter was like 50 years ago, are forgetting the fact that 2 months ago BC was ablaze and had record fires. I mean, the largest area burned since records began.
Yeah,
we've seen huge fires in California, and now we've seen these huge mudslides in California. We've seen these storms in the Maritimes, which have done some unprecedented things. I mean, and Australia is undergoing a huge heat wave right now.
Right.
I mean, it's just, you've got to think not just about what's happening on your doorstep, but what's happening on the entire planet.
Yeah.
And that is what these global temperature records aim to do. They try to take into account the data from everywhere to come up with those numbers.
It's not weather we're dealing with. They're dealing with climate.
It's long-term statistics.
Scales, yeah.
And so my consequence was thinking, well, let's suppose that the Edmonton Oilers win a couple of games next week. Does that suddenly mean they're guaranteed a place in the Stanley Cup playoffs?
Right.
And, two wins doesn't change the long-term trend.
Yeah.
And a cold winter doesn't change the long-term trend.
Yeah.
In fact, 2017, last I heard, was on track to be the second warmest year on record after 2016.
After 2016. Isn't that wild? Like at this point, I think it's foolish to not at least take some stock in these theories and these hypotheses. Like you need to start taking it seriously and really take stock in it, because who knows what the world's going to look like for grandchildren.
That's exactly right.
At 50 years and 100 years from now, we don't know what the changes are going to be.
No, we don't. We can anticipate that it's not going to be pleasant.
Yeah. And
I do worry about, for example, what is the consequence of widespread drought in the southern US.
Right.
I mean, you're going to end up with 100 million climate refugees heading north.
Well, California, for example, right now, I think they had a little bit of rain there, but they're still in record drought. I think,
yes,
right?
For sure. I mean, what happens is that the rain events have become more intense,
right? Which
means you're getting all the flooding and erosion, but the water doesn't persist there. It doesn't go into the long-term soil moisture storage.
Yeah.
And interestingly, there's a lot of work being done recently, which is looking at the effects of the Arctic ice sheet melting on the stability of the jet stream.
Right.
And the suggestion that there is a linkage between this increased warming at the poles and the outflows of the Arctic, of the jet stream, to create these more southerly excursions.
Gotcha.
Which could well be contributing to what we've just experienced recently, and may also be contributing to these large blocking highs, which contribute to the creation of long, dry, hot periods, which then lead to more forest fires.
Right.
And so in 2016, BC got the hot, dry weather and the fires. In 2015, it happened in Alberta, and we got the big fires. Well, we got the Fort Mac fire, which might be... 2016 was the Fort Mac fire. 2017 was the BC fires.
Yeah.
But the idea that you get these intense events, and this could be tied to changes in the circulation and the jet stream in particular.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And that ties us into, I want to start getting into the paper.
Yeah, we need to get to that.
We'll get to that. We're a half hour in here, and we're already going off on just major things. So,
I know.
Right. So, the paper itself, the idea was to talk about the effects on the boreal forest and what exactly is happening there. So, I'm trying to figure out how to get into this because
it's a problem.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the way we looked at it in the paper is to split it into the climate history and what we know is happening in the boreal.
Right.
And basically the trends are that we see warming. It's easily warmed by a degree on average across the boreal, probably larger increases in the north.
Yeah. You said as much as 4 or 5 degrees in the north.
Well, that would be by the end of the century.
By the end of the century.
If we stick to a reasonable projection of carbon dioxide concentration increase.
Oh, I see. Okay.
What I've actually said, and it's published there, so we say it, is that, and I take the credit or the responsibility for saying this, by the year 2050, we are looking at a 2 to 2.5 degree warming relative to the year 2000.
Right.
And we're pretty much committed to that. It doesn't matter what trajectory the greenhouse gas concentration follows, whether it's something like an RCP 8.5 or a 2.6. In the short term, those concentrations are destined to increase because we cannot turn off the tap immediately.
Right.
So you only see major separation in the projections, both in climate and in the CO2 concentration, after around 2040, maybe 2050. So if that's the case, we can pretty much put a number on how much warming we will see across the country and how much we will see across the boreal. And it sort of turns out that, roughly speaking, the boreal is in the central portion of Canada. So the mean increase for the boreal is also going to be roughly the mean increase for Canada.
Gotcha.
You will get smaller increases close to the 49th parallel and in the southern portions of Ontario. You're going to get much greater warming in the Arctic.
What does that mean for the ice sheets up there? Like, is there going to be...
It's the ice and the permafrost. And
the permafrost,
Permafrost is melting, and there's really no question that since about 1970, the rates of degradation have increased markedly, and people have been monitoring this across the country.
Yeah.
It's melting, and it's having an effect.
Maybe you want to explain that positive feedback loop there just quickly.
Well, I'm not sure. Well, the positive feedback is that with the melting and eventual drying out of the peat, we get organic peat, organic material in the permafrost. Initially, there's going to be waterlogging. I mean, there's slumping as the thermokarst events occur.
Right.
But eventually, a lot of that water will drain away or evaporate, and then you end up with basically a dried out wetland of some sort.
Okay.
And I guess it varies because there are going to be some places where the water will tend to pool and it will stay cold and wet, and other places where it's going to drain off and it's going to become relatively dry.
Okay.
One of the big concerns, not just for permafrost but for peatland in general, is that as it dries out, it can also burn. So we have this concern about decomposition, but we also know that a lot of the material in peat is actually relatively recalcitrant. It's not very decomposable. And I'm not sure about the details of that, but we know that, labile material that's fresh foliage or fine roots decomposes very rapidly. But the material that is formed in peat is typically much less attractive to microbes. But if it doesn't decompose, it can dry out and it can burn. So we can get the big wildfires burning in to these areas of layers of peat, and we see this happening. We saw it happening in Fort Mac. The peat burns off the surface, and that's additional carbon dioxide being released to the atmosphere.
Okay. So it's not that specifically the permafrost is holding in the ice; it's holding carbon. It's the organic matter burning after it's been. It's because right now it can't burn because it's frozen.
Basically, it's not going to burn most of it. Yeah, I mean, if it's a little bit at the top that dries off, but most of it is basically wet and cold and frozen. Yes,
and it's thick too. Meat
is thick.
Yeah, they have an assumption that maybe it's 6 inches or a foot thick.
Oh, no,
but
no,
it's-
no. In some places, I believe it's 30 meters deep
Yeah,
or more.
30 meters deep of peat.
Yeah.
Of moss. Yeah, it's yeah.
And it may still take decades to melt.
Yeah.
And some of the projections show that this feedback effect probably isn't going to happen until sometime next century.
Right. So
But it will add, a significant amount. And the calculations probably vary because until recently, there wasn't even much information about how much carbon is contained in these northern peatlands. But
Gotcha.
they are estimates now, and I think the experts are sort of closing in on a number.
mm-hmm.
But sure enough, if all of that were to be oxidized, it would have a huge impact on the atmospheric CO2 concentration.
Right.
Not, I suspect, as much as we've already seen, but
Right.
it's still, another 100 parts per
effect.
million or something, and 200 parts per million. This is a significant effect.
Yeah, that's wild.
And then we have to bear in mind that Canada is a little bit smaller than Siberia,
Mm-hmm.
so the temperatures tend to be a bit warmer
Mm-hmm.
because we have a less continental climate than central Siberia. So these things are happening faster here than they are there.
Right.
So we may end up being the leader of greenhouse gas emissions because of our peatlands and our permafrost, organic permafrost
Mm-hmm.
decomposing.
Right. Which is so it's just adding to the problem. So
Adding to
as
the
it gets
problem.
warmer, it gets so it's
And-
releasing
and-
more and more carbon.
And
Yeah.
the question is whether if we were to stop the temperature rise now, whether that would actually stop these processes from continuing. And I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that.
Right. It sounds like what you were saying. Probably not. Might take a few decades to catch up.
It could very well. But
Yeah.
I mean, equally, maybe we're already past the point where it's
Oh.
becoming a
I see.
Uh,
Where it's
self-
already
self-driving forward positive feedback.
I see. Okay.
And we don't really know, but
Right.
it's a possibility.
Well, continue to look for it, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is a very important area of research.
Absolutely. Okay, so yeah, I guess it's crazy how daunting this whole thing is because every time you turn around and you talk about a new subject, it turns into 7 more subjects.
Probably.
Into how it's all contributing into climate change and the effects. So I guess we should start talking about the changes we can expect in the forest itself, in the boreal forest, and what those changes have, again, more positive feedback loops and on and on and on.
Maybe.
So I guess one of the things was, we'll just start off with this, I guess, is increased vegetation growth. So because of the increase in CO2, you'll have increased respiration, therefore you'll have an increased speed of growth or more growth than you normally have.
Yep.
So assuming that means we'd be taking up more CO2.
Correct.
So I guess we want to talk about why that's not a solution to our problem.
And this is it is a really good question because I explain this to people and they still don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just backtrack a second.
Sure.
Part of the point is that we know that we have a photosynthesis response to rising carbon dioxide, and we know that most C3 plants, as they're called, most plants are C3. They use the C3 physiology. They will respond to an increase in carbon dioxide concentration, and it's roughly speaking a linear response, although it will be sublinear because as the higher the CO2 concentration, things happen and they acclimate and so on. The point being that there are other limitations to how fast that response can occur. I mean,
Right.
the guys who operate in a greenhouse growing tomatoes know very well that you can raise the productivity of their tomatoes probably by a factor of 4 or 5 if you raise the CO2 concentration to 3,000 parts per million, but they are providing unlimited moisture and unlimited nutrients.
Right.
Whereas in the boreal system, we know that in many parts of the boreal, especially in the west, drought will become a limiting factor. It's already a limiting factor.
Mm-hmm.
One of the concerns in Alberta is that we already have a relatively low annual rainfall, and we don't see that increasing dramatically as a result of the climate change, but we do see an increase in evaporation rates because of the increase in temperature.
Right.
So the net effect is going to be that summers will get hotter and drier,
Yeah.
and therefore you're going to get reduced productivity, reduced growth rates, increasing mortality, and maybe a whole slew of other effects.
Right.
But even when you do have all the right conditions, so let's suppose you're in an area, maybe in eastern Canada, where moisture is not limiting and maybe nitrogen isn't limiting, because that is also a major limiting factor. But nitrogen, I think, and again to sort of a sketchy area for me, but we know that nitrogen gets locked up in organic material and is unavailable to the plants.
I see.
However, warming and drier conditions actually stimulates the mineralization of that nitrogen. So you can
Making it available?
Makes it available to the plants. So there is this potential short-term response of greater nitrogen availability and therefore faster growth rates with a higher CO2 concentration. And this is all great if you're growing 2x4s and if you harvest your wood and turn it into,
if that's your only concern, which it is not.
Well, it is. It would be nice if it was your only concern. The problem is we have the disturbances. And in particular, we think about wildfire being the major factor. And the point being that if you grow your forest faster because of higher CO2 concentration, so maybe it gets to be mature in 50 years rather than 60 years, that's great, except that if the fire comes through at 45, it doesn't matter how much more productive that forest is because all of that wood is still going to end up basically being oxidized.
Right.
I mean, you may be able to do salvage or whatever, but the basic argument is that any upside that results from an increase in productivity is going to be offset by the increase in disturbances.
Right.
Plus the fact that when these disturbances occur, they typically do the damage anyway. So it's not as if you're ahead on average. Now, typical fire return intervals might be 50 or 100 years. So if you can operate within that time frame and grow a crop and harvest and protect it, then maybe we're onto something. Because the critical thing there is that we're turning that wood into housing, which presumably puts it into long-term storage, long-term carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
But leaving it in the forest, in a natural ecosystem, is probably not going to help you very much.
It's just part of the cycle. Right?
It's part of the cycle, and all we're really doing is accelerating the cycle.
Right.
But the net effect on atmospheric CO2 is probably going to be close to zero.
Right. So
there's a lot of conservationist argument about why we shouldn't be cutting old growth forest, and I totally support the notion that we should be trying to conserve old growth forest for many, many reasons. But unfortunately, carbon storage, as I see it, is not one of those reasons.
No. It seems like, I was talking, the last podcast I had Vic Leafers on. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
And we were discussing, that was one of the subjects we discussed, was the carbon sequestration aspect. People think that forestry is causing a release of carbon into the atmosphere, where in fact it's the opposite, and the new growth is actually stimulating more carbon sequestration and actually removing more of it. Whereas if we were to leave the forest to be as it is, naturally without any kind of disturbances whatsoever, it would just kind of be this stagnant.
It would sort of max out, and then basically net uptake would become zero until the next fire, and then it would release it all.
Right. Well, with sustainable forest management, we're actually increasing the carbon capacity. If
we do sustainable forest management correctly, yes, we actually have that potential.
Right.
And I would say part of the point is that you have to harvest and turn it into long-lived wood products.
Right.
And then, yes, indeed, you free up some land and you can grow some more trees, and then, yes, they will take up carbon dioxide, and they presumably will be less exposed to the effects of disturbances, not just fire, but insect attacks and diseases and everything else.
Yeah.
So, yes, absolutely. I think we, the Canadian Forest Service and others, would argue that sustainable forest management is going to be necessary both to adapt it in the face of climate change, and it's going to be an essential tool in trying to adapt to climate change.
Right.
And forestry is going to be great for many of these reasons, but it does require that human intervention and management as a way of making full use of it.
Of course. Yeah, that makes
sense. And unfortunately, that means that they're going to be the protected areas, which will presumably suffer in the long run.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's I get overwhelmed sometimes thinking about this whole situation. It's just insane to try and wrap your head around. And I imagine a lot of people listening right now are probably, you need a pen and a paper. You need to sit down and write some of these things down to try and keep your thoughts in order almost. Hey, it's wild. So increased CO2, increased temperature, causing increased precipitation. All these things are
the increase in precipitation, we look at the model projections, and in general, they do not project huge increases in precipitation.
Oh, no. Okay.
I mean, it's 5 or 10% increase.
Okay.
over a period of 100 years, and you don't often see much of a response to the higher warming projections either.
Gotcha. Okay.
Their models are much less consistent about this. Let's be clear that they're pretty consistent in their projections of temperature increase. They're much less consistent in their projections of how much the precipitation will increase on a regional basis.
Gotcha. Okay.
And it's because precipitation is a lot less predictable.
Right. Then yeah, that makes sense. I guess one thing we can start talking about is the move, like how the boreal forest might be migrating. Might move in relation to the changes in. So I guess we have to explain that idea.
Yep.
Maybe you can do it. You're probably better at it than I am. After all, it's your career.
Well, yeah, my career is just. Well, I mean, absolutely. I think there's lots of evidence that we can see changes in species composition occurring, and there are processes at work which cause that. And disturbances, and particularly fire, are one of those.
Right.
We think that in some cases, when you have drought, it's often killing off some species, and then you'll have a fire come through,
right,
and maybe it destroys the seed bank. And what's happening in some cases is that the forest that was there before is not regenerating.
Right.
And in much of the southern boreal, that's going to imply the loss of conifer species, but the deciduous species, and particularly the poplars, the aspens, are notoriously good at seeding into bare areas.
Right.
Because they have these very buoyant, very light seeds which can float for kilometers before they arrive at and there are millions and millions of them.
And they go so fast too. They've got a quick turnaround time.
Probably.
Yeah.
But I mean, compared to conifers,
relative to conifers,
which typically drop the seeds, within a few tens of meters of the parent tree, and very few will get carried long distances. Some do for sure. And we have seen evidence now of fires that come through a burned area maybe 10 or 15 years later, and after the second fire, there is no seed bank there whatsoever, because it was destroyed in the first one and never had. And then the parent trees were destroyed in the first fire. The seed bank that they left grew up, and then that got burned before that second generation had any chance to produce decent seed cover.
Right.
So the consequence is you end up with a huge, almost a moonscape.
Right.
And there are pictures I've seen now of in NWT in Wood Buffalo of the big fires there.
Right.
Where 2 years after the fire, it still looks like the moon. I mean, there's a few logs and nothing else. Hopefully, the deciduous species can seed in there with a bit of luck and some moisture. But what that's going to do, basically, is change the nature of the forest.
Right.
So this notion of migration is more that we will see changes in species composition due to the loss of some species, the species that are more vulnerable to the effects of drought and fire and other disturbances that basically suppresses their regeneration.
So we'll be changing. It sounds to me like the natural subregions will be changing. So that
we'd expect that there will be this sort of gradual shift towards more deciduous, and presumably the conifer might end up further north.
Right.
Except that because of that very limited seed dispersal range that conifers can achieve, they cannot physically produce seed and generate a new population that is much further north than where they started.
Right.
And the rate at which the climate is changing is orders of magnitude faster.
Right.
So we have this notion of climate velocity where in a specific point in time, the climate today is going to increase in temperature by a degree or two in the space of a few decades. And that could easily cause that region to be unable to sustain a population of the species of trees that grow there today. So they will disappear, but they're not going to be able to suddenly magically reappear 200 kilometers further north.
No.
Unless we humans intervene and try to do something about that.
Yeah.
Now, there are other things at work. And one of those, of course, is that when we think about the boreal forest, there are relatively few species, maybe 10 or 12 major dominant tree species. And we have things like black spruce, which grows everywhere from probably northern central Alaska all the way to Newfoundland. And I'm sure that genetically, and I'm no geneticist, but genetically it's a very diverse species. So there's a lot of genetic diversity built into the populations of these tree species. There's also genetic diversity built into the pollen. And one of the things that I learned is basically that pollen, being relatively light, does get blown relatively long distances. So you can imagine that trees can get pollinated from pollen that's from more drought-tolerant or heat-tolerant species.
Gotcha.
Sorry, individuals of the same species further south. So we see this genetic diversity spreading. There's probably genetic diversity inherent in the population. Yep. So there's always going to be some that are more drought-tolerant or more heat-tolerant, and some that are more moisture-tolerant.
Of course.
And so given the huge regeneration that can occur following a disturbance, if there is regeneration, you may well get a new stand that is actually reasonably well adapted to the new climate. Gotcha. Because the climate itself is imposing some selection on the individuals that survive.
Right.
The caveat to that is that the climate may still be changing more rapidly than the trees themselves can tolerate. Typically, we would say it's the early stages, the seedling establishment phase that is the most vulnerable to a change in climate. So if the seedlings can get through that initial 2 or 3 years when the climate is reasonably optimal, they may well be able to survive for another few decades in a suboptimal climate.
Gotcha, that makes sense. You can move this down if it's in your way.
Oh, it's okay now. I can see you.
Yeah. That was one thing that I always thought of when I was in university. That we had someone come in. They're showing us their climate model of where they expect the natural subregions to shift, right? And they said, oh yeah, by the end of 2100, the boreal line will be moved up towards somewhere in, like, let's say Fort McMurray or something, as opposed to
the southern edge. You mean?
Yeah, the southern edge as opposed to Westlock or something. And the first thing I thought of was, but the rotation time of trees is not that fast. Like, there's no way. So I guess all he meant was that the historic climate of those subregions will have moved, but the migration of the actual forest is going to take time.
Yep.
And because of what you're speaking of, the differencing in regeneration qualities or abilities, I should say, it's going to create a completely different forest than what we're used to. Most likely more deciduous or.
We can expect the deciduous species to be there because they seem to be able to colonize much more effectively from further away.
Yeah.
And aspen in particular is very sort of adaptable.
Right.
Its approach to drought is to die back, but it's able to regrow from the stumps.
The roots are still there. Yeah.
So if you have a bad fire, as we saw in Fort Mac, the trees can be burned off the tops, but there can be phenomenal regrowth from the stumps. Even in one season, because a friend of mine, we were out there in September in 2016, and we saw aspen regrowth that was 2 meters high in the area that was basically burned out by the fire.
Yeah.
And they were invading the black spruce area right next to the upland portion where the aspen was dominant.
Right.
But in addition to that, I'm sure that there were parent seeds flying in from other sources.
Yeah. Yeah, they're good at taking over for sure.
Well, I mean, and it's their pioneer role that they should be able to sort of fill up the lands and utilize it effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess all this whole talk is part of the maladaptation you spoke of.
Yes, that's right.
In the paper.
Yeah.
So okay, so is that really any different from the migration? I guess it's all one piece. It's all interconnected.
They're all sort of
species maladaptation is what we're speaking about with the.
It's maladaptation when you fail, and I guess it's adaptability when you succeed.
Right.
So absolutely, if conditions are not suitable, if the seed sources aren't there, we're going to see change in the species composition. Right. And yes, absolutely, I think the ecologists will say that we can look forward to some new ecosystems, novel ecosystems, for which there are no present-day analogues due to this process of species impoverishment, due to the combined effects of climate change and disturbances.
Right. I don't know if you can speak to this portion of it, but in relation to the changing regions and that, I'm sure you're aware that we use seed zones for planting and that, right? And I've spoken to that in past podcasts, so I won't bother explaining it. But do you think that, I mean, this has been a debate, I guess, is whether or not we should be moving those seed zones into higher elevations or into where we predict that those subregions may shift. And I guess people are concerned because they don't they don't want to be the ones to assume that we know better than what Mother Nature can pull off.
Right.
So I guess we don't have to speak ad nauseum about the seed zones, but I figured you might have an opinion about what maybe we should do with that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, we have this notion of assisted migration, and we've written papers on this. People have written papers on this, and it seems to me it's going to be essential that we grab that, bite that bullet, and think about
the initiative,
how we do it, and we better start thinking about it now.
Right.
Guess I lost my train of thought there.
That's all right. It happens.
It was related to. I can't remember.
It's okay. We're talking to seed zones and I don't know.
Well, what I was going to say is that, I mean, I think it's essential. It's probably that we have to address that.
Right.
Oh, I think I was going to make the observation that, Mother Nature may know best, but Mother Nature is going to take her sweet time over this.
Yeah.
And if we want a productive forest, if we want to have some financial and socioeconomic value attached to it, we're going to have to intervene to maintain those things.
Right.
I mean, we are now in this geologic era, which has been called the Anthropocene. Okay. And that essentially probably happened around the time of the Industrial Revolution. We are now masters of our own destiny.
So the Industrial Revolution that's what...
The Anthropocene is where humans started having a big impact on global climate,
that's what we call it.
On everything that happens.
Interesting.
I mean, there is evidence, in fact, of human effects on the climate that go back several thousand years. Mm-hmm. And there's a researcher in the US in particular who's looked at this and figures that you can see from the ice core record the effects of Chinese cultivation of rice paddies.
Okay.
Because at that time, they started flooding areas that were not previously flooded and increasing methane production. And that resulted in a bit of a warming effect.
Really? Okay.
And so anywhere you can see, concentration of human beings changing something that otherwise wouldn't happen has had an impact on climate.
Of course.
But I think the Anthropocene, as we define it, started mid-19th century.
Interesting.
And because we have now got to that point that we are ultimately in control of, we're not able to control the weather, but we're definitely having an impact on the climate. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to start thinking about other things we need to take control of.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not optimistic about the outcome of the northern forests.
Yeah.
If we want to see something survive, we're going to have to get in there and do it.
I think some people might look into this and go, "Oh, so what? The forest is going to change a little bit. Like, not a big deal. Like, that. What does that really mean?" Mm-hmm. And that leads us into biodiversity and animals and insects.
Yep, that's right.
And the role that plays on our lives and our water availability and and all this stuff. So I guess we can start getting into that. The biodiversity aspect, how these things can be expected to change because of climate change and the effects that'll have.
And the short answer is I'm no expert on this. And I have colleagues and friends who know far more about this than I do. We know that if conifer forest characteristics change, there's less old growth. That's going to have an impact on old growth species. Mm-hmm. So I've been hearing a lot about black-backed woodpeckers in the eastern Canada. Yeah. And I guess there are many songbirds and other species that typically use forests, and they're likely to see habitat change. Right. And we have the big issues surrounding caribou. Mm-hmm. Now, in Alberta, maybe that's not just about climate change, but climate change is another factor in the whole thing.
That's a big one I wanted to talk about because I had 3 podcasts on woodland caribou and the management thereof and what we need to do, and we're still sorting out what the proper route is. Right, I'm not going to claim that I know what we should do, but it's a crazy and I think it'd be interesting if you could speak to the potential there, because I mean it seems like in the podcast that I had in the past that yes, the caribou depend on lichen species which grow slowly, which tend to be found in old growth forests, which it seems like are going to be at risk of fire and we're going to be at risk of losing these old growth forests, therefore at risk of losing caribou habitat. Yep. It seems like everything is mounting up against the caribou. Yep. And I don't know at what point do you. This is a totally different question. I don't know why I'm getting into it. I have these things floating around in my head thinking about caribou and whether or not do we have the ability to save all of the herds, or do we maybe focus on the ones that are still relatively sustainable and kind of forget the ones that we think are lost. But that sounds horrible. I don't like the idea of that. I don't want that to happen. But we have to be like, if everything is mounting up against it, and then we also have climate change, which would be naturally removing their habitat, then how are we supposed to deal with that, right? So it's interesting that everything just seems to be mounting up against that species. It's sad to think about.
And I don't have any answers.
Of course, I'm not asking for just.
The experts that I talk to will tell me that it's all about the predators, and that what has happened is that climate change has basically allowed species like white-tailed deer and moose to migrate northward, and the wolves and the other predators basically are following them, and the caribou are suffering almost as collateral damage. They're just easy prey in an environment where the deer run fast and the moose are big and ornery.
Yeah. And the caribou species, the herds are small to begin with.
Well, probably. I mean, a lot smaller than they used to be, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I agree. I no expert, but I get the feeling that caribou are seriously threatened, and I don't know that anyone really has all the answers to that, other than that you pen them, protect them, and maybe we can do something to provide some kind of semi-natural habitat for them in the future.
Yeah.
One of the big issues in all of this, we talk about migration, is that, of course, the soils that in the north really aren't equipped to grow extensive stands, as I understand it. There's a lot of poorly developed soils which just will not.
You get into the northern taiga where it's just rocks.
It's
and
rocks.
Got a centimeter of organic. That's not enough to grow a tree.
Right.
So there is a northern limit to where these forests can go.
Yep.
So arguably you could say that the forest not only will be shifting, but will be getting drastically smaller as it adapts to the climate change.
It will get drastically less productive because, of course, there's also a lot less radiation there. I mean, you get the very long days in the summer, but overall radiation sums are going to be lower.
Right.
So there must be a limiting factor there.
Would you say that just the area covered by the forest is likely to decrease?
I would have thought so.
Yeah.
Just because of
I would think so too.
Because of the way in which the meridians basically converge as you get further north. I mean, we have to get away from
meridians. I was more thinking about the actual northern range limit of the trees.
Well, it's just the land area. I mean, we look at a Mercator projection of Canada,
right,
and you get this misleading sense of how much land there is there.
Right.
If you look at a real projection, you'll see that it's much, much less.
Right.
So you're trying to squeeze all that forest into a smaller,
less productive area.
A smaller area, as well as being potentially less productive climate.
Yeah. Yeah. The biodiversity aspect of it, I can't even begin to understand the implications there. Because, I mean, if you're changing things at this scale, even just changing the temperature a little bit can drastically change, moose calving and survival rates and grouse and woodpeckers and mosquitoes. More mosquitoes, which are killing more moose, which are killing more. And it's all, again, another positive feedback loop.
Negative feedback.
Negative feedback loop,
but
I should say.
I mean, in this case, not very
helpful.
Positive. But yes, absolutely. I mean, the other thing we've been talking about, and we didn't mention this in the paper, is this whole notion of what it's doing to insect biodiversity and, in particular, pest species.
Right.
Insects are very mobile compared to trees, so they can migrate into areas where the trees themselves are not adapted to them. And so we have this notion that as the climate warms, large, vast areas of trees will become immediately accessible to these insect pests that previously would have been excluded because the winters were too cold.
For example, pine beetle
and spruce budworm.
Yeah. So I guess for people that don't know, I haven't had a podcast on pine beetle or pests yet. I plan to have it. I spoke to it a little bit, but I guess for people to understand how climate plays into that is the range of the pine beetle, specifically that one because it's gotten so much attention in the past, has a lot to do with cold winters. So cold winters tend to kill those populations. If you have extended period of extremely cold for extended period of time, it'll kill those off.
Right.
And if we're getting less of that time, they're more likely to be more spread, more potential for those animals to have an epidemic.
An outbreak, which is basically what happened in BC.
Yeah.
We had a succession of milder than normal winters, and the population exploded. More individuals survived over winter and were able to then breed early in the season, and you got this exponential growth phase.
Yeah.
which resulted in millions of hectares being destroyed, essentially. And we now think there's probably another feedback effect because that contributed to fuel buildup, which probably made the fires worse than they would otherwise have been.
Of course.
And of course, that kind of thing can happen in the northern boreal too.
Yeah.
And we have seen some remarkable observations of insect pests occurring much further north than they were previously known, literally in the last few years.
Really?
So I have a colleague who's been doing insect and disease surveys, and he's finding species like spruce budworm occurring almost at the Arctic Ocean.
Ooh, really?
So it's in white spruce stands in the Mackenzie Delta area.
Right.
And as far as we know, it's never been seen there before. And forest tent caterpillar being seen north of Great Slave Lake. These things are, I hate to use the word, but unprecedented ends up being used a lot in the context of climate change these days.
Of course.
And unprecedented may just mean that there were never any humans around to observe it in the past.
Of course, yeah.
Or if they did, they just didn't realize what they were seeing. But our knowledge of what's happened in the last 200 or 300 years is probably pretty good, I'd say.
Yeah, it seems like there's been a lot of focus on that, and then we've been keeping good records for as long as we've been keeping records, I would say. But
we probably could have been keeping better records, but
if we had known, hindsight's 20/20.
Well, there's a lot of political issues that intrude here.
Of course, yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a daunting issue. I mean, there's the number of topics that we went through already in the last hour and a bit. It's fascinating. It just flies, right? Like it just goes through so fast. So I guess we discussed the pests and the pathogens and all that kind of stuff. Is there anything else? The soils, you talked about soils. Do you have any final thoughts maybe that you want to conclude this entire discussion that we've had? I mean, there's a lot to talk about. We're not in a hurry. You don't have to end it right away. But if there's more that I haven't gotten around to asking you about, please feel free to.
Well, I mean, the response I almost feel obligated to come up with is that we this is a challenge. It's not necessarily the end of the world, but we know we've got a huge forest management challenge ahead of us, and we need to think really hard about how we develop solutions to try and address these problems.
Absolutely.
And we may have to do some triaging. We may have to decide some things are clearly important and we need to do them, and some things will need to be sacrificed because they're basically lost causes. I mean, I'm not making any assertions about which are the ones we want to keep and which ones we lose. But, it is a fascinating problem to address. And I think we do need to think about it really carefully and really hard. And there are possible solutions. I mean, technology is evolving rapidly, and there are lots of things that could be done. And so, in terms of remote sensing and robotics, particularly, where we have the possibility of the early detection of pest outbreaks, and maybe there are ways in which we can address these things that are not, that using techniques which 10 or 20 years ago we would have just said was complete science fiction. But
right.
I think now some of these things are possible.
Right.
And we have put bright minds and engineers and scientists working together on this. Maybe there are ways we can enhance our management. We may need to think a lot about how we fragment the landscape to make it more resistant to fires. Yeah. So that you don't lose 500,000 hectares. Maybe you only lose 50,000 hectares in the course of a fire. But how do you at the same time facilitate species migration, caribou migration, all these things that the animals and the birds have to do? Yeah. How do you maintain that connectedness?
Hydrological values and historical use values.
That's right. And
there's so many values.
And all the interests of First Nations communities and their dependence on the land for natural food, and shelter and everything else that many of us don't even think about. But no, it's part of life in the north and in these remote areas that has to be taken into account. It's I say on one hand it's a can of worms, but on the other hand it's a really fascinating challenge.
It is a super fascinating can of worms for sure. That much I can guarantee. Yeah, and it's always been fascinating to me, and it's hard to. It's one of those issues where you just want to find the answer. Right? Well, what's the answer? How do we figure this out? And as with pretty much anything in this world today, it's not as simple as black and white, right?
Absolutely.
We got to wait for. Hopefully, we can wait for guys like Elon Musk to sort out the energy problem for us. And
yeah. Well, sure.
yeah. I think we're good. I think that kind of covers the gist of the paper and kind of what I wanted to get to. It definitely points a scary finger, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So but I think that needs to be pointed. I think people need to know what the reality is here and what we can expect in the future, and maybe start get everybody thinking about the solution, and not a solution, but a multitude of solutions.
That's right.
That can work together.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge. We have a lot of tools in the toolbox.
Yeah,
and some of them are definitely going to be essential.
Yeah,
and we want to work on using those and improving them.
Yeah,
totally.
Yeah, and getting all kinds of industries to work together to try and find a solution to this.
That's probably going to be absolutely essential.
Yeah, it's going to require everybody to get along on this one, which that's always an easy task.
Yes.
Awesome. Well,
okay.
Is there a place where people can get a hold of your paper and read through it, or is
absolutely?
Yeah.
So you can go to the Canadian Forest Service bookstore, as we call it, which essentially is a way of accessing everything that's been published by CFS employees, and in many cases their co-workers who may not always be CFS people. You can also send me an email, I suppose, david.price@canada.ca. Natural Resources Canada website will get you there if you look up forests or forest and climate change. There is a lot of information available.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, if anybody wants to get a hold of that paper, they can, and that's perfect. They can read through it themselves and come up with their own assumptions, their own solutions, and their own questions. If anybody has any questions for me or for David, feel free to contact me or David. He gave his email, so you can send it right to him. Perfect. And you can email me. Don't worry, I haven't gotten very many emails. I wouldn't worry about being inundated with a giant inbox here. You'll be okay. So email me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to rate and review and subscribe, and let me know if you guys have any questions. I can send them to David, or you can ask him himself. And thanks a lot for coming on. This is perfect. I'm really glad we got to discuss this super complicated issue. Definitely the most complicated one I've had to discuss today. I thought the caribou one was complicated, but this is a completely different thing.
Well, yeah.
It's a different scale. So,
no, thanks, Matt, for all your questions. It's been really quite good.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for listening, guys.